we only have 1 month left until we begin fall, and I wanted to take a look at the first fall forecast in this video. I will be posting the actual outlooks on Facebook once this video is over with, but I want to dig into some of the upper air data and all of the different ensemble guidance and some ideas of what this fall might bring for precipitation and temperature wise. This is a look at one of the ensemble models, seasonal models, for September time frame, looking at the upper air maps or the mid-level height. You can see some troughing showing up into the Gulf of Alaska, with a quite a bit of ridging potentially into southern Canada and maybe into the upper Midwest as well for September. When you have troughing into the Gulf of Alaska, that can typically bring more of a mild Pacific flow or more of a mild pattern into the Midwest. So September, if this mid-level heights pattern stays as what this model wants to show, or whatever may happen, this would probably bring a pretty warm September overall. But again, there's so much that goes into this, not just looking at a mid-level height map from one single model. But to know northeast of Canada up into the polar region, there is some troughing showing up here with maybe more of a slightly stretched polar vortex. You can see maybe down here and down here or so. This would bring bouts of cold air potentially though in September, but the exact placement of these bouts of cold air into the United States is pretty uncertain as of now. That's pretty hard to predict. Just like the polar vortex of what that would do in the wintertime, you don't know until the month of or a couple weeks even before what happens. Now, look at October. We have more of an interesting shape of the polar vortex again. Less troughing showing up in the Gulf of Alaska, but less ridging up in the polar region as well. At looking at the mid-level heights, the polar vortex can be maybe slightly more stretched, but this is a little bit more compacted in October than September, with maybe some ridging showing up into the east. This may be more of a east ridging that might show up, with some maybe western troughing into October time frame. Now again, this isn't my forecast. These are just possible solutions of what might happen for upcoming winter as we get closer to the final fall forecast. Then I will dig into what exactly might happen, or you can predict it as well. But this would have more of a western troughing, maybe with more cold air, eastern ridging, with a pretty active pattern over into the United States. This would bring in October time frame. Now taking a look at November, you see some troughing showing up further east into the polar region, with some troughing showing up in southern Canada as well. And I mean, this would bring more of a cooler pattern into the southern portions of the United States, but a warmer pattern into the upper Midwest overall because of that ridging, kind of like what we deal with early in July and June time frame. We had some of the upper Midwest ridging showing up with some heat waves happening, and then further south you get slightly colder air compared to normal usually with these events, but no troughing in the Gulf of Alaska either, but more troughing much further east. So a pretty interesting look here for November from this model. This is a look at a different seasonal ensemble model for September. We see more troughing showing up in Canada, with maybe some ridging showing up into the Gulf of Alaska and stretch out into the upper Midwest as well, with some troughing much further west into the Gulf of Alaska. So will be a weird look on this model for sure for September's upper data, but this would bring more of a split flow in September with a active pattern overall, with likely rounds of warmer air, but maybe a couple shots of cold air as well. But it looks like the troughing, the cold air is more bottled up into the polar region, or up into Canada at least. Normally Canada at this time, so that would make the cold air to struggle to come south. Now looking at October, we have some more troughing showing up into the polar region, more of a disrupted, I guess you can say, polar type of event. We have these different areas of troughing showing up, splitting out of the polar region, with troughing showing up down to the Gulf of Alaska, down into the Pacific, with ridging showing up into the upper Midwest again. But this would bring an active pattern as well. So pretty good agreement on the upper air data for a pretty active fall ahead. So it looks like we can have we may have a pretty wet fall that we'll dig into. But this is also a very interesting look. I agree more onto the European seasonal guidance for the time frame. This is a look at the entire fall months, all 3 months of fall, and you can see it does have a little bit of troughing showing up into the Gulf of Alaska, and then maybe a little bit of troughing further east, with some ridging going up in southern Canada. So this will be to spill in some cold air. You can see around the ridging up in, down into the United States, but it might struggle into the upper Midwest. Upper Midwest might be a pretty mild fall if this upper air data does verify. But for the south to go, we'll have more shots of cooler than normal temperatures. But again, this is just one solution that is still a ways out. Closer to the surface for September, this model again has a pretty warm bias, just so you know, but it has a above average September ahead and a above average October, but also a above average November. But especially for the upper Midwest with cooler normal temperatures the further north you go later this fall. So we may have a pretty mild beginning of fall with more of a cooler normal temperatures in October and November. If this would be the case, because again, this is a warm bias overall, so you can say that November could be below average for up into portions of the Midwest as well. But again, if that ridging continues to show up over the upper Midwest would struggle to get below average temperatures. But maybe this would bring in early snowfall to portions of the Midwest in October or November, which is only a couple months away already. It's pretty crazy to think about. It's about 3 months away until you get to the first snow for some areas. But this would, again, maybe bring some early snowfall, winter storm potential. Who knows? Again, I'm just throwing out some possible ideas out here. This is not a forecast or prediction. But then you can also say that this could be a drier pattern in November, and we don't get much snow at all. But taking a look at the 3 month standpoint, the 3 month map for this fall, this does have above average temperatures through quite a bit of areas of the Midwest and the Northeast, with average temperature the further south you go. But for the Midwest, where I forecast above average temperatures, but not no blowtorch or anything that we're looking at now. For looking at the precipitation for September, pretty active, especially the further southwest you go. In October, it is pretty active for the Midwest, but especially the Northeast. Again, matches up with the upper air data that I did talk about earlier in the video. In November, a pretty active pattern over the Northeast, a little bit drier into portions of the Midwest, with some active, areas as well. So a pretty active fall ahead seems pretty likely. I know this is just one model, but I do agree with it. Just looking at the upper air data, it does seem like we would probably have a pretty active fall. And when you get El Nino that continues to strengthen into the Enzo region, you typically get a pretty active fall, and it can be a pretty active winter as well, but it tends to be warm into the Midwest in the winter time. But in the fall time, it's pretty active in the fall as well. We have a strengthening El Nino. So this does make quite a bit of sense. This is for all 3 months. Again, pretty active overall across much of the United States, really. Into the upper Midwest, it can be pretty dry because of that ridging showing up. So that matches up quite well as well. And then we can look at some other model data before I wrap up this video as well. Taking a look at the CANSIPS model, a different ensemble model for the precipitation for this fall, has a very active pattern into the northeast and southeast portions of the country. It's active into the Midwest, but you can easily see where the storm track favors for this area. Again, this model, has been pretty good for me the last couple of years for winter time frame, but it has struggled this year and showing long range upper air patterns and this long range weather overall. But this is a look at the temperatures, which can have a cold bias. I've noticed this year it's not really much of a cold bias around. It has warmer than average temperatures into the west, but into the Midwest that I cover, it has average to maybe slightly below average temperatures into most of the Midwest and for the southeast as well. This pattern probably won't happen like this. I don't really see this happening. I see more of a above average, slightly above average fall, it seems, as of now. That's what I'm thinking. But it could trend more towards average as we get closer, just because the second half of fall could be the period where it is pretty cool compared to normal, and that would balance out potentially a warm September overall. So I will release another fall forecast into the early to middle of next month, and we'll start talking about winter as well as we get closer into September.